how do you really evaluate claims from ancient history, especially when you're dealing with texts like the New Testament, these intricate prophecies and beliefs people hold very deeply. And when a big-name scholar like Bart Ehrman puts forward his interpretations, how can you, listening right now, really figure out if those conclusions, well, if they actually stand up?
That's exactly what we're trying to get into in this deep dive. It's a really significant scholarly debate we're stepping into. We're looking closely at a critique of Ehrman's methods.
Okay.
The main question is, are his conclusions, the ones you often hear about New Testament prophecies and historical claims, are they really built on solid historical reasoning?
Right.
So we're using a specific source today, a methodological critique of Bart D. Ehrman's New Testament scholarship, The Problem of Destructive Reasoning in Scriptural Analysis. We'll unpack its core arguments, looking at some fascinating stuff, textual analysis, historical fulfillment, even how these ancient books were put together.
And this is crucial for you listening. This isn't about us taking a theological side here. It's about understanding the different ways scholars tackle these incredibly complex questions, these texts.
Yeah.
We want to give you a clear view of the whole debate. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So the first really big point of contention where this critique takes issue with Ehrman, it gets right into how we interpret ancient predictions. Specifically, those New Testament prophecies about the end times, what scholars call eschatology. The critique says Ehrman makes and this is their term, a fundamental logical error. What exactly is that supposed error?
Okay, so what the critique pinpoints as the flaw, the methodological flaw, is this. Instead of looking directly at what the original biblical texts themselves seem to predict, Ehrman apparently focuses on later church interpretations of those same passages, and then when those later ideas don't happen...
I see where this is going.
Right. He concludes that the original predictions must have failed. It's a bit like judging Beethoven's Fifth based on a high school band's attempt to play it, rather than the actual score.
That's quite a charge against a very well-known scholar. But let me push back a bit. Couldn't you argue that how people interpret a text over time is part of its history? And maybe relevant to whether it's seen as fulfilled or not? Why does the critique insist on keeping them totally separate?
That's a really good question, and it gets right to the heart of the critique's argument about historical method.
Okay.
The critique insists that for really rigorous historical work, you have to isolate what the text originally intended to say. Those later interpretations are interesting history in their own right, definitely, but you can't use them to judge the validity of the original claim.
So the method matters.
Exactly. The proper historical method, according to this view, means first figuring out what the original texts actually claimed would happen. Totally separate from later theology. And when you do that with the New Testament's end time stuff, a totally different picture emerges. The critique argues these predictions weren't about, say, the end of the physical universe or a literal second coming like later interpretations thought. They were specifically about, and this is the key phrase, the termination of the Second Jewish Commonwealth.
Okay, that's a very specific claim. If that's the interpretation, the end of the Jewish Commonwealth, what's the actual historical evidence? How does the critique back that up?
Well, the period between roughly 62 and 136 CE becomes absolutely central.
Right.
You have Josephus, the famous Jewish historian from back then, writing about these extraordinary supernatural phenomena before the temple was destroyed. Things like armies seen fighting in the skies over Jerusalem in 62 CE, and he mentions heavenly battalions observed above the temple in early 67 CE.
Wow. Armies in the sky.
Yeah, incredible accounts. And then what followed was just the systematic, almost unbelievable destruction of Jewish civilization. The Second Temple itself destroyed in August 70 CE.
A huge moment in history.
Absolutely. Then the Siege of Masada in 73 CE, those Kitos War revolts around 115-117 CE, and finally the total disaster of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which ended around 136 CE, a complete wiping out.
It sounds just devastating. So the argument is these weren't just random tragic events, but somehow fulfillment.
Precisely. The critique focuses on the correlation, the precision. For instance, the timing of the main Jewish-Roman War itself, it lasted exactly 42 months or 3.5 years, running from January 67 to July 70 CE.
42 months. Where have I heard that number?
Right. It lines up almost exactly with prophecies like Daniel's mention of the middle of the week and Revelation's phrase a time, times, and half a time, which also calculates to 3.5 years.
Oh.
So this entire 74-year span, this whole period of destruction, the critique argues, represents not failed prophecy, but precise historical fulfillment.
That's definitely a different way to frame it. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Another really big area for Ehrman is his analysis of Jesus' identity. This is where the critique says he steps out of history and into theology, right?
That's exactly it. The argument is that Ehrman exceeds the boundaries of historical scholarship. How? By making these definitive theological statements saying Jesus was merely a prophet or revolutionary, not divine.
Okay.
And what's fascinating, as the critique puts it, is that this is seen as unauthorized theological judgment disguised as historical analysis. The idea is that historical tools alone just aren't designed to definitively say yes or no to divinity.
So if historical method has limits there, how does the critique argue against Ehrman's view on Jesus' identity, using the texts themselves?
It brings up this idea of high Christology as foundational evidence. Now, high Christology just means the belief that Jesus is divine, basically God.
Right.
The critique argues this wasn't something invented later by the church. It was right there, foundational from the earliest Christian understanding. And the specific evidence they point to is what they call a systematic substitution of Jesus for YHWH, YHWH being the sacred Hebrew name for God.
Okay. Substitution.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, they point to places where the Septuagint, that's the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament that the New Testament writers often quoted, presents God, YHWH, as the creator.
Got it.
And then in the New Testament writings, Jesus is put into that exact same role, described with the same language used for God the creator in the Septuagint. It's like the new texts are saying, see where the old text said YHWH did this? Well, Jesus does that.
That's a really interesting textual point. But, interpretations evolve, don't they? Couldn't this just show one early way of thinking about Jesus? Not necessarily the only way, or proof against development. What makes it so compelling for the critique?
That's a fair challenge. The critique emphasizes the consistency. It's not just one or two verses. It's presented as a pattern running through the earliest texts.
A pattern, okay.
And then they connect this textual evidence back to the historical fulfillment argument. Remember that exchange between Caiaphas, the high priest, and Jesus?
Yes, the trial scene.
Caiaphas asks him directly from Mark 14, "Are you the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus' answer in Matthew 26 is incredibly bold. He says they'll see him sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven.
Which sounds very divine.
Exactly. According to the critique, Jesus is directly quoting or alluding to Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man figure receives everlasting dominion from the Ancient of Days, a clear reference to God.
Ah, okay.
Caiaphas gets it immediately. He tears his robe, shouts, "Blasphemy!" because he understands Jesus is claiming divine status, divine sonship.
Right.
So the critique's logic ties it all together. Since the civilization fell exactly as Jesus predicted with that specific timing, the wide scope, the utter devastation we talked about, therefore, his claims about being the Son of God are validated by that historical judgment actually happening.
Okay, so the fulfillment of the prophecy about the Commonwealth is linked directly to validating his identity claims. That's quite an argument. So what does all this mean for how the New Testament texts themselves were, put together? Ehrman talks a lot about forgery. How does this critique handle that?
Right. The forgery thesis is a big part of Ehrman's popular work. The critique pushes back hard on this. It argues that suggesting widespread deception ignores how remarkably open the texts seem to be about their own creation, their own editorial processes.
Open, transparent, how so? In ancient documents.
Yeah, it sounds surprising, but they point to examples right in the text. Like in Romans 16, verse 22, it says, "Clear as day, I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, salute you in the Lord."
So someone other than Paul is explicitly named as the scribe.
Exactly. Or 1 Peter 5.12, which mentions, "By Silvanus, a faithful brother unto you, as I suppose I have written briefly." It's acknowledging help, acknowledging collaboration. The critique contrasts this sharply with what we usually call ancient pseudepigraphy. Writings falsely attributed to someone famous. Those typically tried to hide the real author and make it seem like the famous person wrote it directly.
Like finding a letter today,
Yeah.
supposedly from Lincoln, but really written by someone else trying to fool you.
Precisely. But the New Testament texts, the argument goes, openly mention these collaborators, suggesting a different kind of process, one that wasn't about deception in the same way.
Okay, besides those explicit mentions, Are there other clues in the text itself that argue against, say, deliberate forgery or covering things up?
Yes, the critique brings up something biblical scholars call the criterion of embarrassment.
Embarrassment.
Yeah, it refers to details included in the text that seem, well, potentially problematic or awkward for the early church. Things like the different resurrection accounts not lining up perfectly on every single detail,
Right, those minor discrepancies people point out.
or the disciples frequently messing up, misunderstanding Jesus, even abandoning him. The argument is, if you were a competent forger trying to create a convincing, seamless story,
You'd clean that stuff up.
you'd smooth it out, you'd make the heroes look better, the accounts perfectly harmonized. Leaving in the embarrassing bits suggests they were sticking to traditions they received, even the awkward parts.
That makes sense. What else?
And then there's the sheer stylistic diversity. If a committee was forging these documents, you'd expect them to try and make them sound similar, maybe imitate Paul's style everywhere, or aim for a consistent level of, literary quality.
They don't sound the same at all.
Not at all. You have the book of Hebrews, which is written in this incredibly elegant, sophisticated Greek. Then you have, say, First Peter, which is good literary Greek, but then 2 Peter. The Greek is much rougher, maybe reflecting Peter's own background. And Revelation has this very distinct style, heavily influenced by the Septuagint.
So different voices, different skill levels.
Radically different. The critique argues this diversity shows there wasn't some central editorial committee trying to standardize everything or forge a uniform style. It looks more like a collection of distinct writings preserved with their original characteristics intact.
Okay, moving beyond the big themes like prophecy and identity, Ehrman has also focused a lot on the tiny differences between manuscripts, the textual variants. He often presents these as evidence the text got corrupted over time. How does the critique view those same variants?
Yeah, the variants are a cornerstone of Ehrman's popular argument about a corrupted text. The critique, however, sees them very differently. It argues these variants mostly represent just normal scribal practice for the time.
Normal practice, like typos.
Sort of, but more than just typos. It's just the straightforward reality of ancient manuscript production. Think about it. Thousands of copies of New Testament books were being made by hand very early on.
Right, no printing presses.
Exactly. So the critique argues none were exactly identical in the first place. Little variations, a misspelled word, a different word order, maybe leaving out a word or adding a small explanatory note. These were almost inevitable when copying by hand at scale. They weren't necessarily attempts to change theology, just the realities of manual copying.
Okay, so if many of these are just the result of normal hand copying, does the critique see any deeper meaning there? Or is it just stuff happens?
Oh, it definitely sees a deeper implication. It actually flips the script and talks about the strategic advantage of textual elasticity.
Elasticity. Strategic advantage. How can variations be an advantage?
It's a counterintuitive idea, right?
Yeah.
But the critique argues that this very process of mass production, with all its minor variations, paradoxically helped preserve the core message, the conceptual purity of the New Testament. Because these minor variations, the vast majority of them, do not alter the basic facts that undergird Christianity. They don't change who Jesus was, what he did, the resurrection, the core teachings. This creates a kind of transmission elasticity. The text can stretch and accommodate these small changes without breaking, without losing its essential identity.
Elasticity. I like that.
It uses an analogy in the source material. Just as we are all copies of Adam and Eve, yet possess sufficient elasticity to remain recognizably human, so the New Testament manuscripts maintain their essential identity despite minor variations.
So like genetic diversity makes a species stronger.
That's a great way to put it. The core narrative, the essential theology, it argues, remain intact across thousands of copies and centuries of transmission. So these variations, far from being just a problem, are maybe part of the reason the message survives so robustly.
Wow, that really does turn the usual argument about variance on its head. Okay, this is a lot we've covered. If we try to tie this all together now, connect it back to the big picture, how do these specific points about prophecy, Jesus' identity, the text creation, and these variants, how do they all line up with the critique's main argument about prediction and fulfillment?
The critique really emphasizes what it calls the complete correspondence between prediction and fulfillment. It argues that when you look closely, every major element in Revelation finds its direct correspondence in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John.
So not just isolated verses, but a whole system.
A systematic alignment across the entire New Testament corpus is how they put it. They give examples. Revelation 1.7 about seeing him coming on the clouds corresponds directly to Matthew 26.64, that verse Jesus said to Caiaphas.
Okay, yeah, we discussed that one.
Or Revelation 6, verses 12 to 17, with all that language about the sun darkening, moon turning to blood, stars falling, cosmic upheaval language. That corresponds, they say, to Luke 23, verses 27 to 31, where Jesus, on the way to the cross, warns the women of Jerusalem about impending judgment using similar world-shaking imagery.
Linking the apocalyptic imagery to warnings about Jerusalem's fall.
Exactly. And even Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3, talking about the Gentiles trampling a holy city for 42 months, that corresponds to the precise 42-month duration of the Jewish-Roman War we mentioned earlier. It's presented as a tightly woven tapestry.
And didn't the source mention a blood connection? What was that about?
Right. That connects Luke's more historical-sounding predictions with Revelation's symbolic imagery. Luke 21, verses 23 to 24, predicts wrath upon this people, Jerusalem being trampled, people falling by the edge of the sword, becoming Roman slaves.
Sounds pretty grim.
It is, and the critique argues this describes the exact same carnage as Revelation's more apocalyptic visions of judgment and bloodshed, just using different literary styles. One is more historical prose, the other is symbolic vision, but they point to the same horrifying events surrounding 70 CE and after.
Okay, these are powerful claims about internal consistency and fulfillment. But what about outside the Bible? Is there external, non-biblical evidence for these incredibly destructive events? The critique links to prophecy. We're talking about civilization-ending stuff here.
Oh, absolutely. The critique stresses the historical validation from multiple independent sources. You've got Josephus, again, providing detailed eyewitness documentation of the 70 CE destruction. He was there.
Cool primary source, right.
Definitely. Then you have the Talmud, the Jewish rabbinic literature. While some numbers might be hyperbolic, it records unbelievable devastation, especially after the later Bar Kokhba revolt. Things like 4 billion or maybe 64 million killed by Hadrian, descriptions of blood 4 feet deep, the Mediterranean Sea red for 7 miles, rivers of blood carrying boulders. Even allowing for exaggeration, it conveys utter catastrophe.
Unimaginable scale.
And it's not just Jewish sources. Tacitus, the Roman historian, provides Roman imperial documentation of the period. And Dio Cassius, another Roman historian, documents the Bar Kokhba revolt specifically, mentioning 580,000 killed and 985 villages destroyed.
Wow.
So the critique argues these aren't just claims made within the New Testament text. The sheer scale of the destruction they supposedly predicted is massively corroborated by external, independent historical accounts.
Okay, that historical context is powerful. Which brings up maybe a crucial question. If these counter-arguments presented in the critique are, as you've laid them out, potentially strong, with textual and historical backing, why do critiques like Ehrman's, which question the New Testament's reliability and fulfillment, gain so much popular attention? Why do they resonate so widely?
That's a really important question, and the critique offers an explanation rooted in what it calls the interpretive crisis and institutional amnesia within Christianity itself.
Interpretive crisis. Amnesia, what does that mean?
It basically argues that Ehrman's skepticism finds fertile ground, partly because Christianity itself has become deeply confused about how to interpret its own eschatological or end times texts.
How so?
The critique points to the existence of, count 'em, 4 fundamentally contradictory eschatological systems that are all considered mainstream within Christianity today: amillennialism, historicism, dispensational premillennialism, and postmillennialism.
4 different views on the end times, all at once.
4 contradictory views. The source uses this striking term, theological tetralopia.
Tetra what?
Tetralopia, like seeing quadruple, but theologically. It means the church often looks at the same biblical passages about prophecy and sees 4 different, mutually exclusive interpretations simultaneously. It suggests a profound lack of clarity or consensus on what these texts originally meant.
So internal confusion makes external skepticism seem more plausible.
That seems to be the argument. The critique suggests this confusion stems, in part, from history itself. That long period of persecution from 136 to 325 CE, after the Jewish Wars, meant early Christian communities were focused purely on survival.
Right, just trying to stay alive.
Exactly. Not a lot of time for calm, systematic theological development and reflection on historical context. This led, the critique argues, to a kind of loss of historical context and institutional amnesia about the specific first-century events the prophecies might have originally pointed to.
So the memory of that specific 62-136 CE fulfillment got lost in the shuffle of persecution and survival.
That's the idea. And the critique concludes with a pretty sharp point. Institutional ignorance does not negate textual precision. Just because later generations became confused doesn't mean the original texts weren't precise about what they predicted for that first century context.
Okay, so let me try to wrap this up, summarize the critique's core argument as we've discussed it. It seems to be saying that Bart Ehrman's conclusions about prophecy supposedly failing, about Jesus being merely human, about forgery in the New Testament, about variance meaning corruption, are weakened, maybe even undermined, by flaws in his methodology. And that instead, if you look at the historical evidence, especially that incredibly turbulent period from 62 to 136 CE, through the lens of this critique's methodology, that evidence actually seems to support the New Testament's claims about prediction and fulfillment, particularly regarding the end of the Second Temple Jewish state.
That captures the thrust of it really well, yes.
So a final thought then, maybe something for you, our listener, to chew on.
Okay. Building on this idea of interpretive confusion, consider this. Could the very fact that there is so much disagreement within Christianity about interpreting prophecy, this theological tetralopia, could that, paradoxically, actually lend some weight to the idea that a specific, precise historical understanding was maybe lost along the way, rather than it never having existed at all?
So the confusion itself might be evidence of a lost key.
Perhaps. It suggests that maybe sometimes our modern debates and challenges to ancient texts tell us more about our own interpretive frameworks, our own historical distance, maybe even our own institutional amnesia than they do about the original documents themselves. How might recognizing that possibility change how we approach not just ancient history, but maybe even how we evaluate claims and sources today?